Hi everyone, welcome to Salesforce Topics channel. In this video, let us discuss on a topic called as execution context, also called as Apex transaction. What is an execution context or a transaction? Any interaction done by user or any other, the Apex code runs inside a transaction which is also called as execution context. For example, here we are going to take a user interaction with LWC, but interactions can be with anything like Visual Force page, web service call, batch executions, future call, schedule jobs, etc. So now if user clicks on this create SR button, it invokes this method create service request method. To fulfill this interaction, this entire code runs within a execution context. Please note that transaction and execution context both are one and same, just both are interchangeable words. Once completion of this logic, the transaction, that is this execution context, ends with a success or failure response. There are two important things that we need to remember with respect to execution context. One is the scope of static variable is execution context. That means if you declare a static variable anywhere within this transaction, then that static variable will be available till the end of transaction or execution context. For example, here this static variable, I am static variable in SRP is declared over here, and this static variable will be available within this execution context throughout this transaction. Please note, this static variable will be available within this execution context. The other execution context gets a new copy of the static variable. For example, if another user, tech2 user creates service request, then his interaction runs in a separate transaction, that is a separate execution context is maintained for his interaction. And that separate execution context will have its own static variable copy. The next point that we need to remember is governor limits. Each execution context has the fresh governor limits. In case of synchronous interaction, synchronous governor limits gets assigned. If in case the interaction is asynchronous, then asynchronous governor limits gets assigned. Please note that transaction gets succeeded only when there are no exceptions till the end of the transaction. If in case any exception occurred within the transaction and if we have not handled that exception, then the transaction and all DMLs within that transaction gets rolled back. Now let's run this via an app. Over here, let's create one service request by entering the details like account name as G1 and the remaining details like this. Please note this is custom LWC where we have onClick event which actually invokes our Apex class method, that is create service request method of service request processor, this method. And in this method we are creating an account and service request. Once we click on create SR, the Apex logic gets executed within an execution context. In the background, our transaction got successfully executed. That's why we got the success response. Let's open the logs. Observe that entire this thing ran on the single transaction or under single execution context. The first line in the logs is execution started and the last line in the logs is execution finished. Everything in between execution started and execution finished is the execution context. Let's deep dive why these much logs for simple creation of service request, and we will see what is actually getting executed for this interaction within execution context. We know that once user clicks on create SR button, this method gets executed. As an initial step, the execution context gets started with a governor limits. Please note that in our example, we have seen a synchronous transaction. That's why synchronous governor limits gets assigned for this execution context for entire this transaction. On reading of this line, It identifies service request processor class first time, so it has to load. While loading this class, it identifies one static variable, that is I am static variable in SRP. So that static variable scope is within this execution context. That means this variable will be available throughout this transaction within this execution context. While executing this line, it instantiates one object for service request processor. Within that, we can see there is a static variable directly having the scope in the execution context, and one instance variable, I am instance variable in SRP, is located inside this SRP object. In the second line, we are initializing the static variable with some text. So this text will be assigned to the static variable which is available within the execution context. In the third line, we are assigning the instance variable with some text. So on execution of this third line, that instance variable gets assigned inside this object. Please note that this instance variable is specific to this object. This object will be available within this method itself right now. Whereas the static variable available in the execution context scope, hence it is accessible throughout the transaction that we will see in the coming slides. Similar way, it identifies another class here, some other helper class. So first it has to load this class. While loading this class, it identifies one static variable and one instance variable. That static variable scope will be maintained in the execution context, whereas the instance variable is located inside the SOHC object. Same way, in the line number 5, we are assigning the static variable with some text. So that gets assigned in the static variable under the scope of execution context. In the sixth line, we are assigning the instance variable of SOHC. So it gets assigned over here. The main intention of this example is to show these static variables will be available across the transaction. In this line, we are just printing the logs, and then we are creating the account and inserting this account. As we know that during this insert statement, Salesforce execute a series of steps, that is order of execution. This order of execution will have the almost like 20 steps. All these 20 steps included within this transaction itself. And our static variables are available to all these steps. For example, let's explore before apex trigger for the account. We have execution context like this right now. For the execute before apex trigger on the account, we have a trigger logic like this. For the before insert, we have a method where we are just trying to apply this logic. On the first line, we are trying to create service request processor again. If you remember, the same class service request processor has already been loaded in our transaction earlier. So it doesn't load again. So at this line, it only instantiate and the same static variable will be used. Same way, this class also already loaded within the same transaction earlier. For that, static variable also has been maintained in the execution context. So here it just instantiate SOHC object. So observe that by this time our static variable has been having the assigned values whichever we assigned in our earlier class. Now at the line number 3, we are trying to print this static variable. When we try to print this static variable, it takes the value from here and it prints this value. And then when we are trying to print this instance variable of SRP, it will print the value from here, that is null, it will be printed. And in the same way, for some other helper class static variable, when we print that one, it takes the value from the execution context and that value will be printed over here. And the instance variable is taken from this location and it will be printed as null. In the same fashion, we are printing the data even in the after insert handle method of account trigger. That means when it comes to this step, it prints the same kind of logs. Now after completion of all these steps, transaction further moves to the this step, and then this insert step. Again, since it is a insert DML, Salesforce performs the order of execution steps over here. Again, around 20 steps will be executed, and these steps also will be having the access to these static variables. And at the very last step, the commit statements gets executed for these DMLs, and then post commit activities, and finally this transaction gets ended. Please note that transaction gets succeeded only when there are no exceptions till the end of the transaction. If in case any exception occurred within the transaction and if we have not handled that exception, then the transaction and all DMLs within the transaction gets rolled back. Though ours is a very small method, it included many other things like order of execution for these DMLs. And inside of this order of execution step, we have our own customizations. All these things were performed inside this execution context itself. That is the main reason why our logs has these many lines. Now let's see our debug statements. Inside before insert event trigger of account, when we printed the static variable, it has printed the value which was assigned inside service request processor, that is this value. But whereas when we printed the instance variable, it printed the null because the instance variable was initialized inside the trigger itself with a value null. In the same way, for some other helper class static variable, it printed the value which is available inside the scope of execution context. Similar way, for the inside accounts after insert trigger event, when we access the static variable, it is able to take the value available inside in the execution context and it printed. But the instance variable is printed as null because we have not assigned anything inside this trigger event. In this way, by using the static variables, we can communicate among the various steps that are occurred inside a transaction, which is also called as execution context. Thank you for watching.